Hey guys, good morning. Happy Tuesday. Hope you had a good weekend. I'm recording this on Monday, so hope you had a good weekend. I did. It was kind of a lazy weekend. I've had a little bit of a cold. No coronavirus, I promise. But I've had a little bit of a cold, so I was just lazy all weekend. Watched plenty of TV, as I'm sure you can relate to. I watched Toy Story 4 for the first time, which was good. I suppose. It's been like a decade, I think, since Toy Story 3 came out, and I watched that when I was leaving high school to go to college. And so that one, I remember being very emotional. This one is also an emotional movie. They have figured out how to pull on our heartstrings pretty well over in Hollywood. So, coming with you today to talk about a poem. I have a couple things that I wanted to throw your way before we get there. First is a writing prompt. I get these emailed to me once in a while from a guy named John Spencer. So I'm going to share the link to this writing prompt with you, but it's a pretty timely, pretty relevant writing prompt for us. It starts off with you being stuck at home, and this mysterious box shows up, and you get into this box, and you can travel to any any fictional world from any story that you've read. You just pick a page number, I think, that you want to go to from that book, and you're transported there. But you can only pick five of those places. So kind of like a genie in the lamp type situation. You have to make careful choices. So I came up with my list of places that I would be interested in going. I kind of went back and forth on a few of these, but settled on these five. So number one would be Hogwarts Castle, specifically the common rooms, like the Gryffindor common room in Hogwarts Castle. I think that would be just an awesome place to just visit and see and to experience what it would be like to actually attend Hogwarts. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, so it makes sense if you know me. Number two would be to go to Narnia, and not necessarily like all of Narnia, but just that one first scene when they enter into Narnia and they see the lamppost, and just that first image of what it would be like to step into a different world would be crazy. Then a third one that I thought of was also from the Chronicles of Narnia, but is from a different book. And that's when Aslan is walking through this blank and desolate space, and he's just creating the world as he's singing and as he's walking. And so behind him, the world is just being created. And that scene in the book is really descriptive and really fun. And so I think it'd be cool to actually be one of the characters in that scene. Number four was the Shire from Lord of the Rings. It's a really peaceful home type of a place. It's just a little neighborhood, and everybody's like happy, and there's just a bunch of little hobbits enjoying life. And every time I read about it in the books or see it in the movies, it just seems very peaceful. So that would be number four. And then number five is the opposite of peaceful, and that would be Jurassic Park. I would want some stipulations on this one. Obviously, I don't want to get eaten by anything, but a velociraptor specifically. And so I'd want to have some protective gear while I was there. But in the books and in the movies, it seems really peaceful and just a totally different type of nature to be in the actual Jurassic Park. Okay, the second thing I was going to point towards was this website called The Kids Should See This. I've shared this with my students a few times. We've watched some videos from here. It just has random stuff, kind of a time killer for you if you're going to be killing time, but doing so in more of an educational format. So all sorts of videos here. This one says Lego Waffles and Coffee, a Bebop stop motion short. Created with 3,200 photos, YouTuber Bebop cooks up some Lego waffles and coffee in this stop motion cooking short film. So stuff like that, it's just different than what you might find elsewhere on the internet. Most of it is specifically educational in nature, but it's all pretty interesting. Just because it's educational doesn't make it boring automatically. So I would challenge you to find maybe 2 or 3 videos to watch from here, and you can navigate through the different categories and pick whichever ones you want. And they update this pretty routinely. So if you wanted to sign up for their email list, that could be a good thing to do, or to bookmark this as something you browse through in your free time, which you have a lot of. All right, so let's get to the poem. The poem is titled "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud" by William. Excuse me, that cough is annoying. By William Wordsworth from 1802. Super old poem, over 200 years old. And so with anything like this, if it's on a website in the year 2020 and we're talking about it in class, it must have stood the test of time for a reason. There's something about it that makes it unique and powerful. And so we need to figure out what that is. All right, so let's jump in. The main things I'm going to be talking about today are mood, rhyme scheme, imagery, personal connections, perspective, and then there's an idea I kind of noticed in my last read of it, and that's reverse personification. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Don't worry about writing all that down quite yet. So let me read through the poem first, just so we've all heard it and we're all familiar with it, and then we'll jump in. So it starts off: I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Okay, so I wanted to start off by talking about some personal connections here. So this poem is an important one for me because it was one of my grandmother's favorite poems. She passed away about a year ago, and so that kind of thing is just something that is I don't know, it's just fun to think about, like, what my grandmother liked about this, why it was her favorite, and just any sort of connections you have, any sort of memories like that are really important to maintain. So I would, make it a habit of asking a grandparent what's, something that they really enjoy doing or reading or learning about. What are some of their favorites, maybe poems or pictures or paintings or something like that you can then hold on to and continue to think about in the future. So I think it was my grandmother's favorite poem for a couple reasons, but I think she has a lot of similarities to this poem. My grandma and my grandpa planted wildflowers at one point in time to sell. And so there's this really kind of famous picture in my family of my grandma just standing in a field of flowers. It looks a lot like the picture that's attached to the common lit text of that field of daffodils. And so it's just an image that I naturally have in my mind of my grandma. And so there's the connection there. But also there's a connection to the mood of the poem. I think Wordsworth does a really good job of creating this mood, and we'll talk in a second about why that is. And I think the last connection would be the perspective of the author. I think this is also the perspective that my grandma had, and I think it's the perspective that Wordsworth wants all of us to have about life. So how does the author make those connections? Why is this a poem that can be attached to a person like my grandma? Or, for anybody who reads this, I'm sure there are plenty of people who have connections, but why can we attach meaning and significance from this poem to a person? How is the author helping us to do that? The first thing I think would be through the use of imagery and figurative language. I talked about this in my last video, and I think the other teachers have mentioned it as well, but anytime an author uses imagery or descriptive details, they're trying to accomplish something. And I think in this case, the author is very much trying to form a connection with the audience by using some really vivid language. The author wants us to be able to see what this field of daffodils looks like. The author wants us to feel what it's like to be floating like a cloud, like he is doing. And the author wants us to experience what it's like to have these really fond, sentimental memories. And so we see that as we go through the poem, we're able to truly, truly see and feel what it's like to observe this field of daffodils. It's important to note that he's not in the field himself, but he's observing it from above. I think another thing that the author does here, he says, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." So there's action. The author is doing something in the poem. But I don't think we have to read it as Wordsworth being that narrator. I think leaving it vague, having no character descriptions, we don't find out his backstory. We don't find out what he was doing as he was wandering as lonely as a cloud, or why he was wandering lonely as a cloud. We get none of that backstory. Instead, the author is just keeping it vague, and I think the reason for that is he wants us to also have a connection to it. He wants us to be able to put ourselves in his shoes and to experience it like he does. So I think that's a couple reasons why anybody could make a personal connection to this poem. The author really, really wants us to understand this common desire that I think we all have of wanting to dwell or to remember fond memories, and specifically memories attached to nature. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, the second thing, excuse me, the second thing I want to talk about was rhyme and how that rhyme scheme can create mood. So yesterday, Ms. Tresik talked about the rhyme scheme in the Emily Dickinson poem. Hope you enjoyed that one. My little sister's name is Emily Dickinson, but she is not the poet who died like over 100 years ago. So just to clarify, but I do have a little sister named Emily. Yesterday, she talked about rhyme scheme. This one has a rhyme scheme as well, but it's a little bit of a different one. And so I wanted to point that out. So let's just read the first stanza and see if you can spot it before we talk about it. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Okay. So did you figure out what the rhyme scheme would be? Like, is it A, B, C, A, B, A, B, B? Give you a second to think about it. So you'll notice that the first line and the third line rhyme, the second line and the fourth line rhyme, and then the fifth and sixth lines both rhyme. So that would be A, B, A, B, C, C. Something else you might have noticed is that each of the lines has the same amount of syllables. So each line has 8 syllables. I wandered lonely as a cloud. 8. As you read through, it does check out. Each line does have 8. There are just a few lines that you have to read differently to get to that 8. An example would be the first line in the second stanza, which is continuous as the stars that shine. So you have to read continuous as 3 syllables, continuous, which isn't how we always pronounce the amount of syllables there, but that's the way the author intends you to read it. Sometimes authors in these kinds of circumstances will take out a syllable in a word and kind of cram it together, like you see in the second line, which is that floats on high or vales and hills. He just took out the letter V in the word over. That's older language, but it's also just poetic language. So we do see it still in modern day poetry when the author is trying to fit a certain rhyme scheme. You might have heard before that Shakespeare and other prominent poets used a lot of iambic pentameter. This poem is similar to that, except it uses iambic tetrameter, if I'm reading that right. Yeah, tetrameter, which means that there are 8 sounds in each line, and each of those 8 sounds follows a foot pattern. And if you think about a like if you think about walking, and you think about going heel toe, when you actually walk, your heel is the first thing that contacts the ground, and then your toe, and you just think about a walking pattern like that. Walking has a steady rhythm to it, and so poetry oftentimes follows that steady rhythm. So with the vowel sounds that you hear in each of those lines, it follows that foot rhythm. So let's read the first line together. You can kind of clap along with it too, and you can hear that the first sound is going to be harder than the second. So it goes, I wander lonely as a cloud. You can go through the rest of the poem and you can hear that footstep pattern. There are going to be 4 of those feet in each line to get to 8 syllables per line. So why is that important? That all sounds really technical, almost mathematic. Might not seem important. I know there are probably several of you out there who are just like, oh my gosh, I don't care about the rhyme scheme in this poem. Well, it's important in this one because of how it relates to the mood of the story. So whenever authors use this kind of a rhythm or a rhyme scheme, it creates a mood in the poem. In this one, you'll notice as you read through that this one it's very, I would say, joyful, optimistic, happy, positive. And why is that? Well, the language and the content, of course, are positive, but I think it's also heavily attached to the rhyme scheme. And so if we go through and we read it in kind of that bouncing, walking rhythm, we start to feel like, we start to make some connections with what it's like to actually be wandering along and to be walking along at this steady rate, this steady rhythm. It's repetitive, it's continuous, it's predictable, it's consistent throughout the text or throughout the poem. And all of those things are purposeful. The author doesn't need us to read into any sort of specific abstract rhyming scheme. The author just says, here's something predictable. It's almost like a children's story with how predictable the rhyming scheme is. And so the author wants you to feel likewise like it's an innocent, youthful, joyful poem. So you get that mood as you read from the words, and because he's talking about floating and dancing flowers and things like that. But it also does come from the rhyme scheme. So pay attention to that in the future. What is the rhyme scheme? What is the rhythm of a poem? And how does that contribute to the mood? Okay. So in this poem, I think the author is also trying to help us to connect with this common desire of what it's like to think back to positive memories. And so as I read through this poem, I also make some connections to things that come to mind when I am reflecting back, just positive memories that come to mind. And I specifically think of some attached to nature. And so I would challenge you at this point to think, what comes to mind when you think of the most positive, the most pleasant place that you have been. In the last paragraph, in the last stanza, the third to the last line, he says, which is the bliss of solitude. And he's talking about, just laying back, relaxing, and thinking about something that brings bliss and solitude. I bet some memories of nature pop in your head. Maybe it's like a vacation that you went on. Maybe it's a time when you were playing outside when you were a kid. Maybe it's something you did with your family or with friends when you were outside specifically. But there's a lot of value attached to nature in this poem. And I think for us as humans, there's a lot of value attached to connecting with nature as well. So that's where this concept of reverse personification comes into play. So personification is when an author takes something that's not human and makes it human, gives it human qualities, makes it a person. And so in this poem, we see that personification happening with the daffodils. They are tossing their heads in sprightly dance. They are, they're dancing. It makes it feel like they're actually like, these pleasant flowers who are dressed up in some sort of garments or outfits, and they are dancing. And so there's personification happening there with the flowers, but there's also reverse personification happening with the author, with Wordsworth, because he is then becoming like nature, or he is the one who's actually wandering lonely as a cloud. And so what does that part mean? Why is he wandering lonely as a cloud? I think the concept that we're supposed to take away from this is that Wordsworth is making intentional steps to connect with nature. He's not actually becoming a cloud. He's not actually above the daffodils. But what he's doing is he's just taking time out of his day to wander and to pay attention to nature. He's going for a hike, and he's doing so not to get his exercise in, not to get a certain amount of steps in, but just to connect with nature. And so, what can we take away from that? What are things that we should be doing? What are ways that we can also connect with nature? That idea of unity with nature is one that I think we can all relate to as being really satisfying. Think about a time when you were in like a timber or a forest or on a mountain or by a river, by a lake. Think about some of those times and imagine how much peace was attached and how much satisfaction was attached to being in those places. There's something about being united with nature that brings us those kinds of peaceful feelings. Okay, so I'm getting kind of long here, so let me wrap it up. But the author's intention here, like I just said, I think is to get us really thinking about how can we connect with nature, and not just for the sake of getting outside and getting some fresh air, but also of feeling unity and of feeling this wholeness or this oneness with nature. There's something about being outdoors that is unique. We just don't get those same experiences being indoors or doing other hobbies that we enjoy. Yes, I'm sure we all have valuable memories of a movie night with friends or family. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's something just different that nature offers us. I think Wordsworth is also trying to help us to think about, to find positive thoughts to think about, and to specifically attach those to nature. And so I know, a lot of us being at home right now, we're trying to kind of find ways to be productive, to not be bored, things like that. And so one of the things he's urging us here is when we're in that mood, like is in the last stanza, he says, "For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood." So vacant or pensive mood, either we're just thinking about nothing or we're focusing on something, maybe kind of getting stressed out by something. What is something we can go to? What is a go-to memory or image? For me, I have this image in my mind of this mountain. This is a vacation that my wife and I went on before we had our daughter, and we climbed a couple 14er mountains in Colorado, which are 14,000 foot mountains. This was the first one we did, and so it's just the first opportunity I had to climb a huge mountain, the first opportunity we had to do it together, actually. And it was just gorgeous up here. And I connect a lot with Wordsworth in lines 17 and 18 when he says, "I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought." When I was up there, I was trying to take it all in. I was trying to observe, but I didn't necessarily know that memory or that image was going to be so important to me years later. And I think it's those kinds of moments that he wants us to observe. We can't just artificially create it. We can't just go outside and, stare at a tree and say, this is a positive, fond memory. No, we have to actually spend enough time in nature that those moments are naturally created, if that makes sense. And yeah, I think he's saying at the end that he would have never experienced this stuff, like I just said, if he would have tried to do it intentionally, or if he wouldn't have taken the time to wander, right? To be just like independent by himself and to observe. So there's my connection for you at home, is to be thinking about, how can you take advantage of this time to create some of those positive and fond memories. I know the weather isn't great right now, but as soon as it starts getting better and here in the next week or two, do your best to get outside and to observe and to pay attention to the little things and to find beauty in those little things, to find peace and solitude in those little things. And I guarantee those will be some memories that pop into your head later in the future, like Wordsworth when he's just on his couch thinking in vacant or in pensive mood. He experiences that bliss and solitude. So I hope that you get to experience that in this break. Hope it's gives you some worthwhile reasons to take some time to experience and love nature. All right, cool. We'll talk to you soon. Hopefully you enjoyed going through the poem, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. Thanks.